but it's related to something else. It's not related to COVID-19, so don't be alarmed. The second thing is that this talk is not really going to only be about the science of glaciology, but rather what it's like to try to do glaciology during the extremely stressful times of a pandemic. And here, oops, I have to figure out how to go to the next slide. Connected. Let's see. Oh, there we go. I have to use my mouse to click. Here's the outline of my talk. And the only real part that focuses on an actual glaciological phenomena is part D. And I've underlined part D and part F because those are actually serious parts of my talk. Everything else is intended to be humorous. And truth be told, I'm trying to act like a bit of a clown. And I know that many of you come from other cultures, other continents, and English language may not be your first language. Please bear with me and realize that many of the things I'm saying are attempts to be funny and humorous. And that's because I believe that humor is one of the important tools that will help us get through the difficult times we face. So the first part is, why this artwork? Why did I use this on my title slide? Well, let me tell you a bit about this painting. It's called Christina's World because the woman in the foreground is Christina Olsen, and she's looking at her house in Cushing, Maine, from her backyard. And Christina lived during a viral pandemic that was called polio. And she had contracted polio and it had disabled her ability to walk. And as a result, Andrew Wyeth, who lived next door, a very famous artist, saw her crawling around in the yard because she did not like to use wheelchairs. Andrew Wyeth was fascinated with this woman and created some 30 portraits of her. And to this day, Andrew Wyeth is with her as Andrew Wyeth decided to be buried in the cemetery that is next to the house in the distance. But to me, this artwork represents what it's like now during COVID-19, because it shows a bit of loneliness, it shows social distancing, it shows looking across the field towards a place that maybe is not really easy to reach. And it shows a landscape that is confined to the backyard. And it is as much of a psychological landscape as a landscape of a specific place. And one of the things that I decided to do was reenact Christina's World for myself as a kind of statement of how I feel trying to conduct glaciology during the pandemic. So this is me in Doug's world with a toilet roll in my hand, and you'll realize that there's going to be a prominent position of toilet rolls and tissue paper in my seminar. And I decided that I would ask other glaciologists if they agreed with me that the artwork was a statement of some sense of psychological validity that describes how they feel during these hard times of COVID-19. If they would send me a reenactment, and I got several, and I'm going to give you a montage of these reenactments now. The first one is from our IGS Vice President, Gwen Flowers, and this is Gwen's world. This one is from another IGS Vice President, Christina Hulba, and this is Christina's world. Our illustrious and accomplished chief editor of the Journal of Glaciology, Hester Jiskut, sent us Hester's world. Another SE for the Journal of Glaciology and also an expert and accomplished IGS member who has created many symposia that the IGS has held in Southern California. Helen Fricker sends us Helen's World. And here is Regina Hawk's Regine's World. She's looking at her lab that she can't go to in the building of the Geophysical Institute at the University of Alaska. My colleague Allison Banwell sends me Allie's World. My former student Mac Cathles sends me Mac's World. Tim Crates sends me Tim's World. I've asked people in Antarctica to send me reenactments. Karen Joyce sent me this. This is Penguin's World. She also sent me the front cover of her latest novel about Antarctica. And this was a painting of Tina Green looking at Sipel Dome Station, where there's a drill hut in the middle. So this is Tina's World. This is Petra's World. This is Ian Willis, who's contributing Ian's World in the backyards of Cambridge University. This is Becky Goodsell in New Zealand, contributing Becky's World. Many of us have children at home, and that is added to the pressure of the pandemic and the quarantine. Tiffany Shaw contributed this, and it's called Parents' World. I believe the building she's looking at is a school which will obviously remain closed during the pandemic. This is my granddaughter, Isabel Rose Lee, and this is Izzy's World. A famous Antarctic photographer, Anthony Powell, contributed a picture of his cat, Ponting, and this is Ponting's World. And finally, we have the Secretary General of the IGS, Magnus Mar Magnusson, contributing Secretary General's World. And you'll notice that he's wearing the equipment, the PPE that he uses when he's at the blacksmithing forge. So I know that he feels separated from the forge. And he's also looking longingly in the distance at toilet paper, which probably he overbought at the beginning of the quarantine. But I think in the back of his mind, he's thinking of a commemorative toilet roll that the IGS can sell, perhaps to make a little extra money. But before I leave the subject of the artwork, I asked myself, is this really appropriate to show this painting and to reenact it? And the reason for that question mark is that we're really looking at Christine Olsen, who was 57 in this painting. She suffered from polio and could not walk. And, you know, is there a certain inappropriateness of showing someone who's disabled? So I decided to reach out to someone I know here in Chicago who is disabled, who lost both of her legs, and asked if this was appropriate and if they would contribute a reenactment. And that person was US Senator Tammy Duckworth, who's a possible candidate for the US Vice President who would run potentially with Joseph Biden against the Trump ticket. Tammy Duckworth lost both of her legs in a helicopter crash in Iraq during a combat mission. She's biracial, Chinese and Caucasian, and like Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, she was the first US Senator to give birth while in office. Now, I can't say truthfully that Senator Duckworth herself sent this to me, but one of her staff people chose, I think, a picture that is highly appropriate, which I'd like you to look at for a little while, because I think this is, to me, very uplifting. It's called Maylie Pearl's World. Maylie Pearl is the young daughter of Tammy Duckworth. And the reenactment is in the Senate office of Tammy. You can see the screen here showing the Senate chamber. You can see in the distance the Washington Monument and the Capitol building. And there are elements in this picture that do reflect the pose that we see in the Andrew Wyeth painting. First of all, there is her elder daughter down on the ground with skinny arms. Secondly, we see her young daughter, which has the characteristic leg pose and also the characteristic elbow. But what is different in this reenactment is that little Pearl is not looking at the monument in the distance, which is called George Washington Monument, but is instead looking away towards us. Many of us are voters in the United States, and she is probably looking at us, asking us to please create a world that she can live in the future. And above all, the expression on Tammy Duckworth's face is not one of disablement, but is one of extreme ability. And I thank her staff for sending me this. Okay, now we get on to part B, glaciology in Doug's world. And I want you to know that I'm not going to be able to go to my lab for at least a year because my university won't allow it. And it's not wise for me to go there because of the virus. Second of all, I'm engaged in field work in Antarctica with colleagues, and our field project will not go into the field for the next year and possibly longer. So the only glaciology I can do involves phenomena that I can find in my backyard and tools that I have in my quarantine stay-at-home house. So here's the phenomena. I was walking, this is my apartment building where I live, and I was standing right there where the X marks, looking at a parked car, and this is what I saw. On 17 April 2020, this was 4 weeks into the quarantine stay-at-home. It was a light, wet snow with the sun coming out and was still quite cold. This apparently is called a snow roller. And looking more closely at it, I realized that it wasn't just one layer of snow that was rolling. It was actually 2 layers that were very intricately interacting, winding around each other. There was an upstream layer and a downstream layer, and they were rolling together in this exquisitely beautiful glaciological phenomena. And I'll say this, if there had not been a quarantine, stay-at-home lockdown here in Chicago, on the day that this happened, I would have walked past this, paid no attention, and gone to the office where I work and simply struggle with all the usual stuff that's totally unimportant. So my awareness of a snow roll is a result, a tangible result, and a positive result of the pandemic. So I learned from David McClung and his very good book, Avalanche Handbook, that snow rollers are a snow gliding phenomena. Notice the roll here on this car. Here's a children's slide with snow folding up. Notice that there's a cat here. I've seen this before next to toilet paper rolls. And when that happens, I am always suspicious that a cat has been involved somewhere in that process. Here's a snow roller that does not involve 2 layers. It only involves 1 layer. But most of them look like this. And you can see in this corner here that there's an upstream layer, a downstream layer. There actually may be an accumulation zone on the windshield that allows the upstream layer to continually feed the roll. So now we come to the question, what are the tools in Doug's world, in my home, away from my lab, that I can use? And I really only have 2 tools. The first is a knife edge balance between genius and insanity. And the second is that I have a whole lot of toilet paper because I bought a whole lot during the first days of the quarantine. And you'll see that toilet paper is actually not a bad thing for a scientist to have. So before I go into the science of the snow roll and its dynamics, I want to spend a little time telling you about the history of science during pandemics, and especially the interplay between insanity and toilet rolls. And by the way, I want you to read this fine print. Again, not everything I say is true. It's intended to be funny, but some of the strangest things I'll say are actually true. And it's up to you to figure out which. So we begin with the Plague of Justinian in 6th century AD. This was the invention of toilet paper, and the statement by Jan Zitua, I'll read for you: paper on which there are quotations or commentaries from the 5 classics or the names of sages, I dare not use for toilet purposes. This was the first time the word toilet and the word paper were put together. So this was the beginning. Then we move on to the plague of 1665 to 1667. This is significant because during this plague, the University of Cambridge in Cambridge, England, closed down for 2 years. And Isaac Newton was forced to quarantine away from his lab and from his colleagues. But he was apparently familiar with toilet paper and toilet rolls. And I have an English colleague who speculates that Newton's experience with the toilet roll led him to his argument with Leibniz over the nature of vortices. Moving on, we have Marie Curie, twice Nobel Prize winner. She lived through the smallpox epidemic of 1870 to 1875. And during her lab work, she came across the realization that toilet rolls can spontaneously unroll themselves through no volition of an interfering human. And I think this is something that you may have experienced in your life. Have you ever dropped a toilet roll on the ground in a public bathroom and see it unroll itself like this, going through the stalls neighboring you, and then feeling incredibly frustrated that this happened, this spontaneous breaking apart of the organization of the roll? And I wonder if this was a metaphor in her imagination for radioactive decay. We move on to the cholera epidemic of 1881 to 1896. And during that epidemic, Albert Einstein may have had to use the loo, or the bathroom. And while he was there, he may have been exposed to the fact that many toilet rolls were actually recessed into the walls of the room. Seeing the walls wrap around the toilet roll as here and here may have given him the idea that space-time could wrap around mass. Continuing on, we come to the Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge University, Paul Dirac, who Einstein said sat on the knife balance between genius and insanity. He was inspired by toilet rolls to think about the 7th type of quark. Quarks come in up, charm, top, down, strange, and bottom. But he proposed that there could also be a roll. And that's because of spin state entanglements that exist in the quantum world. Where did this idea come from? It is said that Dirac had a play date arranged for his cat and Schrodinger's cat, where they would play together. And Dirac witnessed the entanglement of rolling and unrolling toilet paper as a result of these cats. And that may have given him his idea. We have Wolfgang Pauli, inventor of the exclusion principle. He lived through the epidemic of influenza, 1918 to 1920. And his childhood house was fraught with conflict between his parents over whether a toilet roll could be rolled up inward like this or outward like that, and whether apparently those two states were excluded from his house because his parents fought so much about whether, you know, one state or the other was right. And this gave him possibly the idea of the exclusion principle. My colleague of my university, Enrico Fermi, lived through the influenza period as well. And it said that he had a dream where there was a big pile of toilet rolls, and he knew Madame Curie had understood that a toilet roll could spontaneously unroll itself, liberating energy. And this could happen by a tiny, tiny little stimulus. And in his dream, he thought of a big pile of toilet rolls, and he saw one toilet roll unrolling itself, liberating energy, but the toilet roll bumped into two toilet rolls and started them to unwind, liberating energy. And then those two bumped into two more each, and ad infinitum. Finally, the last character in the history of science is Max Perutz. He lived through the influenza of 1918 and also a much more terrible pandemic, the Holocaust of 1933 to 1945. He is the 1962 winner of the Nobel Prize in Physical Chemistry for the discovery of the structure of hemoglobin. But what most people don't realize is that he was a glaciologist. When he was in Germany in 1936, it was arranged for him to emigrate to the United Kingdom. And the person who arranged this was none other than the founder of the IGS, Gerald Seligman. Gerald Seligman gave him a postdoc, and during that postdoc, Perutz was discovered by Lawrence Bragg, who was the director of the Cavendish Institute at University of Cambridge. But during the early period of Perutz's scientific career, he was very much engaged in glaciology. And in fact, here are pictures of Max Perutz. On the left is him on Jungfraujoch in 1949. And on the right is him with none other than John Glenn. John Glenn, our Glenn's flow law. Max Perutz was on the thesis committee of John Glenn and was an advisor to John Nye. John Glenn and John Nye were both at the Cavendish lab in Cambridge in the late 40s and early 50s. But you're probably wondering, okay, well, I can buy the fact that a Nobel Prize winner was a glaciologist, but what's the connection to toilet paper? Come on, Doug, are you being silly here? This is where I'm being very serious. Here is a paper in the first volume of the Journal of Glaciology, and I'm going to read the title. A description of the iceberg aircraft carrier and the bearing of the mechanical properties of frozen wood pulp upon some problems of glacier flow. Who is the author? Max Perutz. Look at that paper. And I did some research with my colleagues. I asked them to fire up the scanning electron microscope. Let's look at two-ply toilet paper and let's look at wood pulp. Is there a similarity? And the answer is yes. Wood pulp is nothing less or more than an industrialized form of toilet paper. And what Max Perutz describes in his paper is a veritable Manhattan Project devoted to testing frozen toilet tissue, which was also called pykrete, in a project called Habakkuk. And the purpose of the project was to use frozen toilet tissue, also known as pykrete, to make a battleship, one that could deliver aircraft into the theater of combat in World War II. Okay, so we finished that part of my talk. So now I want to talk about snow roll dynamics, So here's where a little bit of science comes in. And please remember, I'm only doing this science with the limited tools available to me in my quarantine environment. The hardest part of any kind of roll initiation is, well, it is the roll initiation. How do you start a snow roller? How do you start it? Here's what I theorize and hypothesize, and I plan to do much more research on this. This diagram that you see here is a cross-section of the car on which I saw the toilet roll, the snow roll. Here is the front windshield of the car. Here's the seat of the car. The wheel would be here, and here's the dashboard and the front hood. A sunroof is here, and the black part here is the glass, and the blue part is the snow. Now, when I saw the snow roll, I realized that the sun had just come out and was shining shortwave radiation through the sunroof, and it was hitting the black leather seat in the car. And I hypothesized that long-wave radiation radiating out from the seat had melted the underside of the snow coating the upper part of the windshield. But because of the shadow, the fact that the long-wave radiation could not reach underneath the dashboard here or beyond the dashboard, I felt that there was a frozen snow layer there, and that there would be a freeze-thaw transition between a wet-based and a frozen-based snow layer. What more general problem is there in glaciology than transitions between wet base and frozen base? So this is a universal problem, and it's now got to be applied to snow rolls. So the upper part of the snow layer is able to slip. The bottom layer is frozen to the glass. I have a photo here from Jeff Kavanaugh. He had the presence of mind when he saw the inception of a snow roll that you see here on the left, to get in the car and to photograph through the glass. And he sent me this photograph. And you can see that the upper part here does not have any of these little blue dots. I've blown the blue dots up. The blue dots represent the big ice that is frozen to the windshield. These are the kind of ice crystals that you have to scrape off your windshield with some kind of a tool, a scraper tool. Whereas in the up side of it, there are none of these indications of a frozen contact with the glass. So now I come to my only equation in this talk. I spent many, many hours trying to think about the geometry of snow rolls and what that implied for the physics of how a snow roll would either unwind or wind back up. And I realized that the roll itself is like a circle, and therefore its volume or area is pi r squared, whereas what it's rolling up or what it's leaving behind as it unrolls is the geometry of a very thin rectangle. And I developed a relationship between the length of unrolling and the radius of the roll itself. And I found that it is like a square root relationship, and that this implies that the path of the center of the roll will be like a sideways parabola, and that path will intersect the plane of rolling at a right angle. And what is the implication of that? That means that the center of mass has to follow this sideways parabolic path. And that implies that a roll is energetically able to spontaneously unroll itself. It can roll out, leaving behind the paper. I'm sure you're familiar with this, but no one is ever going to see a roll of toilet paper or a roll of snow spontaneously roll itself up, because it cannot overcome the potential energy barrier of the fact that this path of the center of mass becomes vertical on the plane of the rolling. So that's the essence of the problem of roll initiation. So we exclude the possibility that, so here is the sliding part of the snow, here is the frozen part with the transition. We have to exclude the idea that the roll started up at the top of the windshield because nothing could power it. How does it get through the energy barrier of starting up? So the next idea that came is Euler buckling and folding. That this upper layer started to slide, and at the point of frozen transition, the sliding upper layer actually buckled up into a fold, and then that fold tumbled over, and that began the rolling process. And what is so brilliant here in this idea is that the energy needed to initiate this process is provided by the down gradient sliding of the upper snow. So, and that is why I say it's essential that the upper part be sliding in order to power the rolling of the lower part. So how do you get buckling and folding to work? Well, the upper part being on a wet base has to rely on what are called longitudinal stresses or membrane stresses to balance its driving stress. Whereas down here where it's frozen, the driving stress is balanced by local basal shear stress. So let's think about this interaction between these two types of snow movement. I decided that I would use my tool, my research tool, the one that is available to me, toilet paper. And what I did is I took the toilet paper and laid it out on my laboratory bench. And I put a piece of Magnus Magnuson's Wootz steel on this part of the toilet paper. This represents the rigidity of the frozen bedded snow layer. Whereas over here, this is the snow layer that's able to slide. So this would be the upside of the windshield, and this would be the downside, and the transition is right on this line here. So here's the experiment. I pushed a compressive stress into the toilet paper of the upper layer, and there in front of my eyes, the layer reared up into a buckling. And I said, this is the initiation process of the snow roller. And it turns out David McClung agrees with me, and he showed me snow glide on wet grass where there are common folds that develop. So this is not unknown. So now we get to the next and last scientific part of my talk, and that is, okay, once you initiate the snow roller, how do you keep it in a round shape? So I thought about this for a long time, and it occurred to me that the one common element of all toilet paper rolls that hold their shape is a hard core, this hard cardboard core. So that was the secret that popped in my head. So I began to ask the question, is toilet paper, hard or soft? So I went to the faucet with some toilet tissue. I put it under water, and I found that it literally disintegrated in my hands. So this stopped me for a few days. How are we going to keep the snow roll going? I have a freezer in my house. So I took some toilet roll and tissue, and I rolled it up into a little folded sausage here. I put it in the freezer, and then I conducted tests with it. The first test was I took it and I put it with the roll like this, and I found that yes, indeed, I could roll toilet tissue around it, and it would hold its shape. And in fact, if I put it on an inclined plane and gave it a push, it would literally roll up the toilet tissue. Eureka, it's the hard core that keeps the snow roller going. You might ask me, Doug, are you really that brilliant that you can think of freezing toilet tissue? Well, it turns out that this toilet tissue is very hard. I tried to cut it with a knife, and I found that it was one of the hardest things I've ever tried to cut with a knife. And that takes me back to Max Perutz and his famous Journal of Glaciology paper, where he talks about the mechanical properties of frozen wood pulp upon some problems of glacier flow. And there in his paper, I found this table, which gives measurements of the penetration of a 30-03 rifle bullet into some materials. Softwood, it's 63 centimeters, pure ice, it's 35. But for 14% of the addition of toilet paper into ice, you take the 35 centimeters and it's reduced by more than half. So eureka, this is a connection between my research methods and the research methods that Max Perutz was engaged in with, well, it wasn't toilet paper, they didn't use that word, but it was wood pulp. But what's the difference? So here is my vision of how the hard core develops. We have to freeze. This is the roll here. This is the upstream sliding layer. This is the downstream frozen layer. Gravity is pointing down at 45 degrees. And on the top are free surfaces, including in this little syntaxis here. Here in the reference frame of the snow roller, the upstream layer is overtaking the snow roll and wrapping around. Whereas in that same reference frame, the frozen layer is coming in and it's literally being peeled off the glass like you peel off masking tape and entrained into the roll. So what are these layers like? This is the warm, wet layer. This is the cold, dry snow layer. And what happens thermodynamically is we're taking the warm, wet layer and it's going up over the top and in here, but also the dry, cold layer is coming up underneath, and the two are meeting here, and they're also meeting here. So these are the two syntaxis points of the snow roll. At this point here, the bottom side of the wet layer is freezing to the top side of the cold layer. That's where hardness is coming. But then on the other side, we have another syntaxis, and that's where the top side of the warm, wet layer is freezing to the top side of the cold, frozen layer. So that is really the statement of how and why the snow roller can keep its shape. So now you're asking me, Doug, where do you go from here? I mean, maybe you should just retire, give up on glaciology, because what problem could you solve that would rise to this level of curiosity? Well, I actually did find another problem. One of the other things I do in my pandemic quarantine is I throw away old magazines. My mother collected this magazine from the date of my brother being born. Sadly, both my mother and brother are deceased, so I was going to throw away this magazine. I noticed that it refers to a snowscape at St. Moritz, Switzerland on the front cover, but in thumbing through, I saw what was on the last page. Wow, that is a backyard glaciological phenomena, if there ever was one. And then looking at the caption here, it's hard to see. It was photographed in Chicago, in my backyard. I have a responsibility to work on this problem, even though it's from 1958. And there we have a close-up of the next problem. And I invite people to come and help me with this. So now I'm sort of at the end of my talk, and I want to thank people who've helped me. Turns out no human wanted to be my colleague with this project. They wouldn't sign on as a co-author. Only my daughter's cat, Grindy, is thanked because she was able to do the reenactment of the play date between Schrodinger's cat and Dirac's cat. I want to thank Tavi, and this is Tavi's world. Tavi has really done an incredible service to the glaciological community, holding us together during this time when there's nothing but social distancing, causing us to lose contact with each other. And the last thing I have to do is I have to announce next week's IGS Global Seminar, which I do here. We have Chloe Gustafson and Bernd Kulesa, and they're going to be giving a seminar on wet, hot rocks and cool geophysics. Does subglacial groundwater lubricate Antarctic ice flow? This is next Wednesday. But before I go off this slide, let me say that one thing I found is that no field worker that I know in glaciology has ever doubted the research properties of toilet rolls. They say that toilet roll is the proper, most essential element that any field glaciological expedition has to have as part of its tools. And Bernd and Chloe are, if not the best field workers in glaciology, they are among the best. And in order to celebrate their abundant knowledge of the role of toilet tissue as being part of field equipment, I've decided to scatter a few toilet rolls throughout their banner slide here. And it's a little bit like a Where's Waldo project. You can see if you can find them. I'm sure that Tavi is going to take a cleaned up version of this banner and post it on Facebook and on CryoList. So to Chloe and Bernd, I apologize for slightly defacing your banner in good humor, of course, but Tavi is going to clean the problem up later. So at this stage, I come to the end of my seminar, and I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Doug. So questions for Doug. The way that we've normally done this is if people just type into the chat and we'll find you and unmute you. I think you said that you had submitted this as a paper, Doug.
I have submitted, yes. I have submitted it as a paper. Would you like me to tell you about that?
Oh, tell us the title at least. I assume that that's...
I think the title says something like Backyard Glaciology : and then there's something about that. And the reason I did that is I wanted to start a tradition or possible tradition where people would feel that it was okay to submit a paper or a study about a problem in glaciology that was actually not very important, but which still had some kind of element of teaching in it, or of wonder, or of curiosity. Unfortunately, I'm very much worried that my paper has not fared well in review. The other element of difficulty with that paper is that I originally did not base it on a statement by Andrew Wyeth. I based it on a statement of Louis Agassiz, who said, I went traveling for science over the summer, and I got no more farther than my backyard. And I realized that I was cherry picking a scientific idea from Louis Agassiz. And at the same time, Louis Agassiz is someone who promoted a form of scientific racism in the US prior to the Civil War. So I realize now that it would be inappropriate for me to let that paper go through with a reference to Agassiz that was not either appropriately handled or that was not necessary. So anyway, I really invite other people to submit papers to journals, and I hope it's the Journal of Glaciology or Annals, where they feel that it's possible to work on things that are curious rather than just important.
So there's a question from Ben. Let me you can either just unmute yourself, Ben, or I'll try and find you. Go for it.
Hey, Doug, great talk.
Thank you, Ben.
I was wondering, in your diagram where you showed the roll coming down the windshield, and there was the place where the warm snow had advected on top of the cold snow. Does the position of that contact determine where the freezing front is, or does the freezing front gradually moving down the windshield determine where the edge of the roll is going to be?
I don't know, and I think the answer lies in the question of whether the frozen side is adhering to the glass strong enough so as to avoid being peeled up like a tape. Now, if the adhesion is very strong, then obviously the energy release as the roll moves downhill won't be strong enough to peel the frozen layer up. So in that case, you would have to wait for the freezing front to move. But it turns out that there's water on the upstream side that is also moving toward the transition as the snow on the upstream side is melting. So it may be that there is a subglacial hydrology beneath the upper layers of the snow on the upside of the transition. That hydrology is moving into the freeze-thaw transition and is facilitating the melting there, the peeling up of the frozen layer, and making the roller move faster than if it were simply waiting for the radiative dynamics to move the transition downhill on the windshield. So I hope that helps you, Ben.
I think it does, thanks.
I'm not sure, Adam, do you have a question there, or was that? David Meyer, let me just find you. Go ahead, David.
Thank you. Great talk, Doug. I had a question about the actual experimental medium that you use. So conventional toilet paper has perforations between the sheets, which kind of creates like these discrete entities. Do you think that that affects the location of the onset of the initial folding, or like, would you expect to get different experimental results if, say, you use a similar weight of paper that was a true continuous sheet?
David, you really hit the nail on the head. And, you know, I'd hope nobody would notice that, but that Euler buckling actually had its downstream edge pinned to the perforations. And obviously at the point of perforation on a toilet paper, there is much less bending moment is required to produce a very much larger deflection of the neutral plane of the toilet paper. So I think that you've really pointed to a valid issue. I think that I don't really have an answer for it, and obviously I'm going to have to go and do more work on this, David. But I'm going to come back at you a little bit and say, look, isn't there a way for you to use satellite remote sensing to find more of these snow rollers? Because at this stage, we are observationally bound. We do not have enough of these observations of snow rollers to really get that observational surety that we understand the phenomena. And what we need are satellite glaciologists who have the skill to find these things throughout all the world. So David, I implore you to step up to responsibility and start finding these things in your work.
Challenge accepted, Doug. Challenge accepted.
Bruce, you're unmuted if you want to ask your question verbally.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, first of all, excellent talk, very enjoyable, Doug. I appreciate the approach, the methods, the conclusions, everything were great. But I grew up in Colorado and live in Colorado, and I've never seen this phenomenon on a car. And so I think our snow is just too thick. It comes, you know, too many centimeters at a time. So I'm wondering, did you look into a range of sort of the ratio of windshield runout length to snow thickness that this phenomenon is limited to?
Bruce, it's always good to talk to you. And again, your question is very challenging and perceptive. I will say that Chicago's altitude is 157 meters above sea level. And probably where you are, you're over maybe about 2,000 meters above sea level. And
1,700, yeah.
1,700. Okay, so you know you've thought of snow thickness as a issue. I'm thinking about altitude as an issue. You know, maybe down here where the air is thicker, maybe that air, you know, somehow grabs the snow roll more and tries to pull it downhill. That's sort of what I'm thinking. But I don't really feel that I can directly answer your question. However, I do call on people in high altitude regions to really firmly establish the absence of snow rolls there. I mean, this could be simply that you're not looking for them enough. You know, that there is an observational record that is underdeveloped at high altitude. So I put that back at you, Bruce. Let's see you get up there and make some more observations.
I guess I should get off my bike and spend more time on the roads. That's a good point.
No, it's not on the road. It's parked cars. Parked cars, yes.
Yeah, but there aren't any parked cars on the bike paths is my point. So, but thanks.
Sorry for that misunderstanding, Bruce.
No problem.
Matthew, do you want to make your point?
No, I think you can just stay in chat.
Okay, let's find Hester then. Oops. You're unmuted, Hester.
Okay, hi Doug, thank you.
Go ahead.
My question is about recycled toilet paper. So I think if you use recycled toilet paper for two reasons: one, the rheology may be different, and two, you may actually reduce the effect of global warming by using recycled toilet paper instead of new toilet paper, because not a lot of trees will be cut down. So how would you approach that question?
Well, I think, Hester, as always, I thank you for all you do for the IGS as the chief editor, and also for your magnificent seminar last week. But I think you have really come up with not only a scientific, but also a social question. And that is, what really is the relationship between ice and toilet paper, if not within the carbon budget? It may be that, you know, I'm wrong. It may be that Peretz is wrong and toilet paper has nothing to do with glaciers directly, but indirectly. How humans use toilet paper, as you so carefully point out, you know, do we recycle it or do we just throw it away or burn it and let it back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide? Perhaps there is the ultimate relationship between ice and toilet paper. And Hester, I think it is only you that has this wide view of glaciology from your position as chief editor that really could recognize that essential relationship between ice and toilet paper. So I thank you. Best wishes.
We have an observation of snow rollers in Juneau, apparently, from Andrew Bliss. So your altitude relationship is being strengthened.
As I understand it, Juneau is at sea level.
Any last questions or comments for Doug? I think we've reached a natural end there. Thank you very much for your talk, really enjoyable. I have to say I've never seen a snow roller, so I'm going to have to come to Chicago just to see them. So